What if the most carefully designed town in America was also a movie set, and nobody who lived there was quite sure which came first? That question sits at the center of Chapter 11. Florida 30, a seaside, sea haven, and shipwrecks, where a stretch of Gulf Coast highway connects ancient trading paths, architect-drafted building codes, and a 1998 film that turned a real neighborhood into a fictional prison of cheerful facades. From the moment Robert Davis hired two architects to draw an entire town from scratch on inherited beachfront land, this corridor began accumulating layers of deliberate invention, and the story doesn't stop at the shoreline, where sunken movie props and sculpture reefs are quietly building an artificial seafloor to match the manufactured coast above it. Standing on the verge of the asphalt in Blue Mountain Beach, I survey the pavement that dragged this coast from an age of mosquitoes and grit into the era of infinity pools and tapas. Scenic Highway 30A operates as a chronological land bridge. It spans the gap between the modern vacationer, a creature defined by high thread count sheets and an aggressive fear of gluten, and the ghosts of the Scots pioneers, whose idea of a relaxing Sunday involved wrestling a mule through a swamp and hoping the fever skipped the high ground. The two-lane blacktop unified the corridor, stitching isolated beach hamlets into a continuous seaside gallery. Before state engineers pushed the road through, these settlements remained islands of quartz sand separated by coastal dune lakes and profound solitude. Bureaucrats recorded the achievement with dry satisfaction, noting in their files that the bridges connected all the small beach communities to each other for the first time. Civilization had finally arrived to complicate the simple life. Paving the route eventually became an exercise in branding. Earning state and national scenic byway titles over the following decades brought stricter planning rules that favor walkable town centers over strip malls, keeping the view pristine enough to justify the price of a rental cottage. Yet the physical alignment of the road also maps local defiance. When the highway arrived, the residents of Grayton Beach demonstrated a heroic level of stubbornness and persuaded planners to swing the pavement around their old village core. This decision preserved the 1890s neighborhood's identity, saving it from becoming just another drive-by blur in the rearview mirror. Beneath modern tires lies a palimpsest of travel that predates the invention of the wheel, or at least the internal combustion engine. Long before the highway materialized, the region relied on the Econachate trading path. Recorded by the British in 1778, this indigenous corridor connected the Choctawhatchee River's mouth to the Chattahoochee inland, functioning as an early artery for packhorse caravans laden with deerskins and optimism. Rivers carried the trade that roads ignored. To the keen observer, the water itself formed the original infrastructure. The Choctawhatchee River and Bay operated as the God-made roads preferred by 19th-century timbermen, who viewed man-made sand tracks with deep, practical disdain. Naval stores and hides floated to Pensacola markets on liquid routes, undisturbed by stop signs or repaving budgets. When Walton County scratched out dirt roads in the 1820s, they were often just formalized versions of ancient native trails, proving the fastest route through the scrub is usually the one someone else cut 500 years ago. Seeking to experience the coast with a level of vulnerability a climate-controlled SUV cannot provide, I turned to the Timpoochee Trail. Constructed in stages over recent decades, this paved multi-use path traces the highway for approximately 18 miles. Planners designed the concrete ribbon to recalibrate car-first habits, a noble attempt to pry Americans away from their steering wheels and force them to interact directly with the humidity. Named to honor Timpoochee Kinnard, the Yuchi leader whose desperate 1830s search for a safe haven we tracked earlier, the trail acts as a rolling classroom. It crosses the Dune Lake outfalls on low wooden bridges, allowing cyclists to observe the coastal ridge ecology without sinking into the muck. The non-motorized route links state parks and forest tracts, transforming a simple bike ride into an active survey of the Panhandle's natural history. Navigating the path requires martial vigilance. The trail constitutes a democracy of motion where the laws of physics negotiate with the laws of tourism. I dodge a gauntlet of users that includes the grim-faced marathon runner treating vacation like a punishment, the wobbling toddler discovering the cruel indifference of gravity, the sunburned father dragging a beach wagon with the resignation of a draft horse, and the electric bicyclist. This final figure's ability to breeze uphill without breaking a sweat suggests that the greatest modern sin is not sloth, but battery-assisted hubris. Seaside's genesis. New Urbanism's unexpected blueprint. Escaping the gauntlet of electric bicycles on the Timpoochee Trail, I found my tires humming a transition from the chaotic scrub of the wild dunes into something suspiciously perfect. I had arrived in Seaside. It is the architectural equivalent of a heavy linen shirt that somehow stays completely crisp in a saltwater swamp. While the previous miles of the trail offered a rugged communion with prickly pear and the ghost of Chief Sam Story, this stretch felt less like a Florida road trip and more like I had pedaled into a brightly colored diagram of a utopian society. I paused to wipe the humidity from my forehead, acutely aware that my sweaty, unkempt presence was likely violating at least 3 distinct zoning ordinances just by standing still. This town is no mere collection of expensive rental cottages. It is the epicenter of the new urbanism movement. Before it became a globally influential case study analyzed by furrowed-browed architects in black turtlenecks, it was just a patch of scrubby sand owned by J.S. Smolyan. In 1946, Smolyan, a department store executive from Birmingham with an eye for a bargain, bought 80 acres here for $8,000. That is roughly $100 an acre. To put that in perspective, you generally cannot purchase a decent pair of sunglasses in this zip code today for $100. Smolyan envisioned a summer retreat for his employees. The idea evaporated into the humid air. The land sat dormant until 1978. That year, J.S.'s grandson, Robert Davis, inherited the tract. Davis did not want to build just another cluster of condos. He wanted to resurrect the social mechanics of the pre-war South. In 1981 and 1982, he hired Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk to sketch a town plan that prioritized front porches over garage doors and human interaction over automotive dominance. The resulting layout was formally adopted in 1982, positioning Seaside as a private, master-planned alternative to the highway-driven sprawl consuming the rest of the state. Walking to the store became a heavily engineered amenity rather than something your ancestors did because they were poor. The true genius of Seaside, and the reason it feels like a movie set, lurks in the paperwork. The town is governed by an urban code. The document is so rigorously effective it functions less like a town charter and more like the source code for a civilization simulation. This slim graphic rulebook fits on a single sheet, yet it dictates everything from roof pitches to fence materials. The aesthetic discipline is absolute. The code mandates picket fences on specific lots to create a visual rhythm, but, crucially, no 2 fence designs on the same street can be identical. It demands that porches act as semi-public rooms. These architectural features are engineered specifically to force you to say hello to your neighbors, whether you like them or not. It is mandatory friendliness, codified by law. I left the bike behind to navigate the pedestrian-friendly grid. The design philosophy became immediately tangible. Planners used civic anchors to orient the wanderer. The Seaside Chapel, designed by Scott Merrill, rises as a serene white beacon. Beach pavilions transform simple dune crossings into heavily structured portals. Each pavilion was designed by a different architect, turning a walk to the water into a localized art history lesson. The heart of the town, Central Square, along with the artist colony of Ruskin Place, mimics the courtyard DNA of New Orleans, condensing the energy of a city into a space small enough to cross in a minute. The Seaside Institute, founded in 1982, ensures this philosophy spreads, handing out the annual Seaside Prize to those who advocate for walkable blocks and coastal resilience. This terrifying clarity of design seduced Hollywood. In the late 1990s, director Peter Weir needed a location that looked too good to be true for the Truman Show. He found it here. The town portrayed the fictional town of Sea Haven. Suddenly, the post office, Modica Market, and the modest yellow cottage at 31 Natchez Street became recognizable landmarks far beyond the Panhandle. The cottage, known to pilgrims as the Truman House, still bears the number 36 above the door, a fake address for a fake character, attached to a real house in a real town that often feels like a fake town. The film proved that a master-planned community could act as both an economic model for neighbors like watercolor and a pop culture symbol of surreal perfection. Standing in front of that yellow house, I felt the weight of the historical corridor pressing down on me. This was the pivot point where the ancient geology of the dune lakes and the colonial trading paths met the modern machinery of leisure. The Timpoochee Trail had delivered me from the wild history of the coast into its manicured future. I stood there, a solitary figure comprehending the vast, engineered blueprint of urban planning, ready to decode the sociological implications of the built environment with the intellect of a scholar and the soul of a poet. I was also looking for the ice cream shop. Seaside's Truman Show, Hollywood's perfect town. I abandoned the search for ice cream and opted for strong coffee. I needed a cure for the mild existential headache that comes from staring at a real cottage where the owners have bolted the fictional house number 36 above the door. My quest to separate the living town from the fictional Sea Haven of Peter Weir's 1998 satire, The Truman Show, required caffeine. I found that remedy at Modica Market in Central Square. The store felt confusingly familiar. That is likely because its owner, Charlie Modica Jr., had a cameo in the movie standing on his rolling ladder. Even the town founders, Robert and Darrell Davis, were drafted as extras for a cafe scene. Here in Seaside, the line between urban planner and background artist is as thin as the plot of a reality show. Seaside's famously strict urban code creates a visual coherence so potent it feels scripted. Weir reportedly scouted other coasts, but settled here because the pastel cottages and calculated sightlines offered a ready-made cinematic order that no soundstage could replicate cheaper. If Seaside is the Apollonian dream of order, where nature is tamed by white fences and perfect geometry, then the inland swamps are the Dionysian nightmare of biological revolt. A short drive initially took me away from the coast to the Wesley House at Eden Gardens State Park in Point Washington. This was the setting for the 1972 eco-horror cult classic Frogs. The contrast to 30A was absolute. Here, the horrors were not existential questions about free will, but rather Ray Milland being menaced by grumpy amphibians. The 1890s mansion, built on timber and turpentine money, provided a grand moss-draped backdrop that required zero-set dressing to look ominous. It was a reminder that before this coast was a master-planned resort, it was a humid, untamed frontier. I also passed through the setting of Ruby in Paradise, 1993, near Panama City Beach. The Florida grit backdrop there clashed sharply with the polished aesthetic I had left behind in Seaside, capturing the shoulder season melancholy that persists when the tourists go home. Expanding my radius to the broader Emerald Coast, I traced the frantic logistical footprint of Jaws 2. Universal Studios fled the winter winds of Martha's Vineyard in 1977 and turned the US 98 corridor, spanning Navarre, Okaloosa Island and Destin, into the fictional Amity Island. The production headquarters was the Navarre Beach Holiday Inn. That detail lends a certain bureaucratic romance to the art of filmmaking. The famous teen hangout scenes were captured inside the original Hog's Breath Saloon on Okaloosa Island. The true heroism of the production, however, belonged to the local extras. The studio filmed a summer blockbuster in a freezing North Florida December. This required the shivering cast to hold ice cubes in their mouths before takes. The trick was designed to match the ambient temperature of their mouths to the air so their breath would not fog. The cinematic timeline concluded with a literal splash off Panama City Beach, just east of the 30A corridor. On November 20th, 2025, I watched as the coast engaged in a unique form of recycling. It was turning a movie prop into a house for fish. The vessel was a 97-foot steel simulation of the Black Pearl, formerly used in the Pirates of the Caribbean sequels. It was a prime candidate for sinking because it lacked the messy engines and fuel systems of a real ship. That made it cleaner to scuttle. The hybrid steel hull and wooden superstructure slipped beneath the surface to become an artificial reef. It struck me as the ultimate act of Florida pragmatism. We spend decades building fake worlds for entertainment. When we are done, we simply drown them to improve the fishing. 30A reefs, art, shipwrecks, and underwater cities. That strategic drowning of cinematic assets is merely the opening act of a grander obsession gripping the 30A corridor. Having sufficiently conquered the dunes with pastel cottages, local groups and planners have turned their gaze to the seabed, determined to gentrify the void. Artificial reefs along this coast operate like underwater community gardens. Instead of simply building condos on the sand, marine advocates are strategically placing durable structures on the featureless Gulf floor to cultivate life. The headline act of this subaquatic urban planning is the Underwater Museum of Art. Situated precisely 0.93 miles off the shoreline of Grayton Beach, this installation reclines at a depth of roughly 60 feet, safely below the churning nonsense of surface life. It holds the distinction of being the first permanent underwater sculpture park in the United States, a title that suggests there was a temporary one somewhere that simply floated away. The installation represents a partnership between the Cultural Arts Alliance and the South Walton Artificial Reef Association, an alliance that effectively turns gallery curators into marine biologists. A juried panel selects the sculptures for deployment. Evaluators ostensibly judge artistic merit, structural integrity, and how well a given piece functions as a duplex for snapper. Operators deploy these works into waters that are naturally 95% flat sand, a terrifyingly barren area where a single concrete structure offers the allure of an oasis. The moment these sculptures hit the seafloor, they cease to be mere art and become fish-friendly architecture, quickly covered in marine growth that pundits might call biofouling, but which the artists surely accept as a collaborative texture added by the ocean itself. For travelers lacking the certification to breathe compressed air strapped to a tank, planners thoughtfully designed nearshore snorkel reefs mere football fields from the sand. These shallow clusters remain accessible to anyone equipped with flippers and a modicum of courage. Here, the gravitas of high art gives way to whimsical concrete masonry units shaped like local fauna. The corridor features a dolphin reef at Miramar Beach, a seahorse reef at Topsail Hill, and a sea turtle reef at Grayton, all constructed from marine-safe limestone and concrete. Building a concrete turtle to attract a real turtle is a delightfully literal approach to habitat creation. Such a strategy would be considered madness in terrestrial game hunting, but it works brilliantly in the Gulf. Planners carefully aligned these clusters with public beach access points, ensuring parking and restrooms are available for the humans before they waddle into the surf to commune with the bait fish. Yet, art alone cannot satisfy the hunger of the deep. The ambition of this reef program extends well beyond statues. The region aggressively engineers vertical relief, a polite term for placing massive obstacles in the water to confuse currents and attract apex predators. The crown jewel of this heavy metal initiative is the impending sacrifice of the SS United States. This 990-foot mid-century ocean liner was once the fastest passenger ship in the world. It is slated to be scuttled roughly southwest of Destin in 180 feet of water in early 2026. Transforming a rusted hulk into the world's largest artificial reef is a project of massive scale. Down in the dark, thousands of tons of aluminum and steel will operate as a laboratory for researchers comparing colonization rates on different alloys. This impending plunge echoes the fate of the SS Weimar, a historic steamer that previously supported Admiral Byrd's Antarctic expedition before finding its permanent parking spot off Port St. Joe in 1942. Now resting in a shallow 25 feet of water on Bell Shoal, the Weimar functions as a reliable dive site and an underwater classroom for ship anatomy. It is a designated underwater archaeological preserve. Here, the slow accumulation of coral proves that if you wait long enough, a navigational error simply becomes a heritage site. The economic design of this arrangement operates with calculated precision. By converting industrial refuse and artistic whim into habitat, the coast cultivates a recurring revenue stream for charter boat captains ferrying divers to see things intentionally thrown overboard. Planners even envision an onshore museum for the SS United States, guaranteeing that heritage tourism dollars are harvested on dry land before visitors ever wet a toe. In this system, safe anchoring protects the natural coral, crews strip the oily machinery to protect the water, and the fish, completely oblivious to the economics, simply accept the free housing. New Urbanism, 30 A's architectural masterpieces unveiled. Precise vertical relief is equally valuable above the waves. After contemplating the submerged concrete habitats designed to recruit fish, I turned my gaze inland toward the meticulously engineered habitats designed to recruit humans. Just as the underwater museum relies on careful placement to jumpstart an ecosystem on barren sand, the terrestrial stretch of Scenic Highway 30A depends on rigorous architectural codes to coax civilization from land historically dismissed by locals as worthless scrub. I continued east from Seaside along the Timpoochee Trail, a paved path constructed to liberate Americans from their cars, a logistical labor historically more difficult than locating the Fountain of Youth, to explore the master-planned triumvirate of Watercolor, Rosemary Beach, and Alice Beach. These communities are the direct descendants of Seaside, the 1982 experiment that proved stringent design codes could conjure a high-value resort destination out of thin air and pine needles. My first stop was Watercolor, a sprawling 499-acre domain launched around 1999 that occupies the acreage between Seaside and Grayton. When conquistadors like Narvaez and De Soto marched through this region seeking gold, they found only starvation and hostile arrows. 4 centuries later, the modern planners at Cooper Robertson and Partners sought a seamless integration with nature and found real estate premiums. The community wraps around Western Lake, one of the rare coastal dune lakes that dictate local geology. Its layout is undeniably park-forward, utilizing Cerulean Park as a green spine to organize the landscape. The Watercolor Inn, designed by David Rockwell and opened in 2002, anchors the waterfront. The development garnered an ASLA Merit Award that same year and a ULI Award for Excellence in 2004, accolades that essentially promised buyers the bushes would remain trimmed in perpetuity. It felt less like a functional town and more like a very expensive, highly groomed summer camp where nature is politely asked to cooperate with property values. I pressed eastward to Rosemary Beach, a settlement conceived in 1995 adjacent to the older Inlet Beach veterans community. If watercolor is a celebration of the landscape, Rosemary Beach is a celebration of masonry. The planners at DPZ, Duane Plater Zyberk, instituted a strict aesthetic code based on a Caribbean and Dutch West Indies palette. The result is a dense, highly walkable grid of stiff white stucco, deep porches and boardwalk lanes that funnel pedestrians into tight social spaces, effectively mandating neighborliness by decree. The first residences were completed in 1997, and the town hall opened its doors in 1999. However, the true genius of the operation was the initial testing phase. Before unleashing the full code, developers constructed a modest carriage house prototype, led by Richard Gibbs of Seaside fame, to road test the rules. It operated as a strategic skirmish before the full invasion of luxury, ensuring the aesthetic war was won before the first major battle was fought. Leaving the Dutch West Indies simulation behind, I cycled toward the stark, blinding horizon of Alice Beach. The salt-sprayed bike chain clicked its rhythmic friction song. Alice is my favorite of the corridor's enclaves. I remember driving through here in the dark back in 2008, when the development was barely a concept in the sand. There was nothing but a single building and an Olympic-sized fiery cauldron burning in the night. Today, Alice Beach is where the new urbanist model stops being merely cute and starts being formidable. Ground broke here in 2004, following a 2003 design charrette on 158 acres the Stevens family had acquired in the late 1970s. The town architects, Marianne Corey Vogt and Eric Vogt, overseen by DPZ, devised a code that fuses the architectural forms of Bermuda and Antigua, Guatemala into a sculptural, all-white massing. The structures reflect the sun with an intensity that requires high-quality sunglasses just to survive a walk down the sidewalk. But this stark beauty carries a martial undercurrent. Unlike the fragile wooden settlements of the 16th century that were routinely obliterated by Gulf hurricanes, Alice Beach is built to endure. The code demands that every structure meet IBHS fortified standards, necessitating masonry walls, concrete tile roofs, and impact-rated openings. It is a luxury calm reinforced by a bunker mentality, an architectural acknowledgement that on this coast, the wind will eventually win unless you build out of stone. The Kaliza Pool, which debuted in 2008 and contained that surreal flaming cauldron I saw in the dark, centers this beachfront fortress like a courtyard oasis protected by high white walls. The Timpoochee Trail connects these distinct city-states, allowing a traveler to drift from the shaded lanes of Rosemary to the fortifications of Alice and the greenways of Watercolor without ever turning an ignition key. The path recalibrates the senses, forcing an appreciation for the coastal risk management that underpins the beauty. I pedaled past the manicured verges, observing the successful implementation of stringent design codes, the fortifications meant to outlast the next great storm, and the endless white stucco holding firm against the blue sky. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 11, Florida 30, a seaside, sea haven, and shipwrecks. From a 1778 trading path to a sunken movie prop black pearl, this stretch of coast is one of the most deliberately designed places in America, where urban codes, film sets, walking trails, and artificial reefs have been shaped with equal intention above and below the waterline. As for what comes next, this is actually the final chapter, so the journey ends here on the Gulf shore. If you enjoyed this ride along 30A, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors and Condos, and if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon. Thanks for listening to The Rise the Limit. Oil spills, hurricane seasons, and a condo that took 15 years to break even. Welcome to Chapter 12. Destin, Deepwater Horizon, and 30 a Design, where the Gulf Coast's postcard-perfect shoreline turns out to be a decades-long stress test in disguise. From Spanish explorers who showed up and got promptly destroyed by storms, to new urbanist planners who decided the answer to nature's chaos was better sidewalks and height caps, this stretch of the Florida Panhandle has been reinventing itself since before reinvention was a marketing strategy. Strap in, because somewhere between a 1925 Seine boat and a BP settlement check, a surprisingly coherent story about design, disaster, and high-end real estate starts to make a wry kind of sense. It is generally assumed you cannot purchase happiness. Yet history suggests a multinational energy corporation can absolutely buy a second wind for a coastal economy, provided the check clears. Following the curated rise of Seaside and the frantic paving of the late 20th century, a development period that finally wrestled isolated fishing hamlets into a cohesive, highly profitable retreat, the regional timeline slammed into a wall of black sludge. It marked a distinct shift where a local history of precarious boom and bust cycles, typically dictated by prevailing winds or timber markets, was suddenly controlled by a mechanical valve deep beneath the sea. To grasp the localized panic that gripped these shores, one must look 50 miles west and 5,000 feet down. On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon, a semi-submersible drilling rig resembling a floating municipality of pipe and ambition, suffered a catastrophic blowout in the Macondo prospect. The mechanics of the failure read like a Greek tragedy engineered by a committee trying to save a few dollars. Methane gas surged up the wellbore, bypassed faulty cement barriers, and ignited, completely defeating the rig's safety systems. The critical piece of hardware designed to stop this exact scenario, the blowout preventer, BOP, failed to seal the well. Investigators later revealed the device suffered from a low battery and hydraulic leaks. The offshore drilling equivalent of realizing your smoke detector requires a new 9-volt battery while your kitchen is actively ablaze. The explosion killed 11 crew members and injured 17 others. This grim human toll prefaced an extended environmental siege. When the rig sank on April 22nd, the pipe buckled. For 87 days, the compromised well vented crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. The final tally was roughly 3.19 million barrels, a volume so difficult to comprehend that nightly news networks resorted to graphic visual aids that terrified audiences across the country. While the physical slick primarily punished Louisiana marshlands, the Florida Panhandle suffered a crisis of phantom menace. National broadcasts splashed graphics of red blobs consuming the entire Gulf, plausibly suggesting the sugar-white quartz sands of South Walton were about to be paved in wet asphalt. In reality, the regional corridor saw only scattered tar balls and light sheens, which were quickly cleaned by crews patrolling the surf. Perception, however, functions as a highly volatile currency driven entirely by consumer psychology. To the average tourist arriving from Atlanta or Nashville, the beach was ruined. The resulting revenue shock hit with the blunt logistical force of a Category 3 hurricane. Families cancelled trips in droves. Roughly 1.88 million planned visits to Northwest Florida evaporated within a single year, taking $1.3 billion in visitor spending with them. I recall the grim, quiet mood of that summer. The prevailing anxiety rarely centered on the mechanical reality of sticky sand. Instead, an existential dread radiated from property owners who had bought condominiums at the 2005 market peak and were now watching their rental calendars bleed dry. The silence in the resort lobbies felt entirely unnatural. It provided a harsh philosophical lesson for the locals. Coastal beauty is an immensely profitable commodity, right up until the exact moment outsiders believe it is contaminated. The subsequent rebound bypassed a gentle recovery entirely. It arrived instead as a rocket-assisted market launch fueled directly by the industrial disaster. The underlying strategy was relatively simple. Replace the fear of crude oil with the fear of missing out, executing the pivot with an absolute deluge of cash. Attempting to salvage its public standing, BP poured money into the affected region. The South Walton Tourism Bureau found itself armed with approximately $8 million of settlement funds for an aggressive marketing campaign. This brings us to the strange reality of the Find Your Perfect Beach blitz. On the surface, it operated as a wholesome invitation to rediscover the emerald waters and pristine dunes, presenting a visual love letter to nature. At its core, this sun-drenched serenity acted as a remarkably expensive carapace for a multi-billion-dollar liability payout. We were essentially being invited to relax in a paradise heavily subsidized by a catastrophic industrial accident. The county even bought 4,900 gift cards worth $250 each, spending over $1.2 million, to explicitly bribe visitors to come back. It functioned as the municipal equivalent of an apology bouquet the size of a shipping container. The strategy worked with frightening efficiency. By 2011, bed tax collections in South Walton were up nearly 50%. The federal government and Gulf states eventually reached a global settlement valued at over $20 billion, with Florida securing approximately $2 billion of that total. Managed by Triumph Gulf Coast, a massive portion of this capital began flowing directly into public infrastructure. The architectural evidence of this financial discontinuity remains visible everywhere I look today. The handsome wooden dune walkovers at Edwarline and Gulfview Heights, standing sturdy against the salt air, are built entirely on the foundation of settlement checks. Offshore, the South Walton Artificial Reef Association, SWARA, dropped heavy concrete towers to create marine habitats, cleanly converting a disaster recovery effort into a recreational diving attraction. The irony is difficult to ignore. An oil spill that momentarily threatened to kill the regional tourism industry ultimately provided the capital required to consolidate the 30A brand into an aggressively exclusive luxury market. The crisis created a distinct disconnect in the timeline, a brief pause where the high-end market held its breath before inhaling a massive influx of marketing and infrastructure funding. The devastating low point of 2010 paradoxically generated the required currency for the region's most profound rise in developmental status. Today, the local problem is no longer empty beaches, but finding a parking spot anywhere near them. It is a gridlocked, traffic-clogged confirmation that in Florida, even a catastrophe can be refinanced into a boom. The water continues to act as the governor of this coast. It actively shapes the land through seasonal tides, cyclonic storms, and the massive legal settlements those waters inevitably wash ashore. Florida hurricanes, Luna's folly, 30-year resilience. While British Petroleum could write a check to mask an industrial failure, no amount of negotiation has ever persuaded the Gulf of Mexico to calm down during hurricane season. The local archives tell a story not of oil, but of water and wind. It is a violently energetic motif that has shaped this coast from the first doomed Spanish footprint to the reinforced concrete of today's vacation rentals. History here is essentially a record of Europeans underestimating the weather. In the 16th century, Pánfilo de Narváez, a man whose ambition was matched only by his profound misfortune, arrived in the Caribbean ready to conquer Florida. He failed to reach the mainland before the atmosphere tried to kill him. While anchored in Cuba in late October 1527, a hurricane struck with such staggering violence that it sank his ships, drowned his horses, and terrified his men into what can only be described as a distinct lack of conquering spirit. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, the expedition's treasurer and eventual chronicler, noted that the survivors were so traumatized they begged to winter in Cuba rather than sail on. He wrote that nothing so terrible as this storm had been seen in those parts before, describing men linking arms in groups of 7 or 8, just to keep from being blown into the trees like loose palmetto fronds. Just a few decades later, Tristán de Luna y Arellano made the same mistake with even more expensive consequences. He brought 1,500 people and 11 ships to Pensacola Bay in August 1559 to establish a permanent colony. In a stroke of logistical genius that history has judged rather harshly, Luna decided to keep all the food and tools on the ships, believing them to be safer, guarded warehouses than anything his crew could build on land. 5 weeks later, a hurricane sank the entire fleet. The storm roared in on September 19 and instantly nullified the strategic ambition of the Spanish Empire in the region, turning a colonization mission into a starvation crisis. Moving livestock into a dense, mosquito-infested forest at the first sign of a stiff breeze sounds like an overreaction by people lacking a reliable forecast. Yet in 1559, staying put in the path of a surge meant drowning inside a collapsing wooden shelter. This meteorological bullying did not stop when the Spanish left. The modern history of the 30A corridor is punctuated by tempests carrying the names of sweet grandmothers, yet delivering the blunt force of demolition crews. In 1975, Eloise erased up to 70 feet of beach width in a single afternoon. In 1995, Opal scoured the dunes near Grayton Beach so thoroughly that the surge found historic pathways around the sandhills and rushed directly into Western Lake. Then came the successive impacts of Ivan and Dennis in 2004 and 2005, carving escarpments into the shore that looked less like soft dunes and more like sheer cliffs. Today, coastal survival involves building smarter sandcastles. The master-planned communities of Alice Beach and Rosemary Beach have successfully monetized resilience, borrowing architectural forms from Bermuda and the Dutch West Indies, places that figured out long ago how to survive a bay blow. Alice Beach strictly mandates fortified construction standards. Masonry walls and heavy concrete tile roofs are required by code, effectively turning luxury properties into luxurious bunkers that just happen to feature very nice courtyards. It is a heavily capitalized acknowledgement that surviving the geometry of the Gulf requires architecture capable of taking a punch. 30A economy, high-end tourism, hidden costs. Guarding the coast against the brute force of a hurricane is excellent preparation for guarding a bank account against the brute force of a market crash. While the previous centuries defined survival here by how well one could dodge a Spanish shipwreck or a Category 4 storm, the modern era measures survival by how well one navigates the treacherous waters of insurance premiums and zoning codes. This strip of Florida transitioned from a frontier of desperate colonization to a master-planned engine of high-end tourism. The greatest threat to a settler is no longer starvation. It is the failure to cover the monthly homeowners association dues. The economic reality of Scenic Highway 30A relies entirely on the illusion of effortless leisure. It sells a curated coastal life where the primary natural resources are sun-washed pallets and porch culture. This tranquility is manufactured by a rigid scarcity that borders on the theological. South Walton County enforces a strict 50-foot height limit, a commandment that prevents the rise of towering concrete monoliths and ensures that ocean views remain as rare and expensive as a calm day in hurricane season. This policy props up the 30A brand, turning towns like Seaside and Rosemary Beach into scarcity-driven assets that generate over $60 million annually in bed tax alone. The landscape looks like a 19th-century village, but it operates with the ruthless efficiency of a 21st-century hedge fund. Beneath the pastel siding, the mechanics of this rental machine remain grindingly complex. The vast majority of these condos survive on a short-term rental system. That is explicitly excluded from the county's certificate program, yet, inevitably, since municipalities rarely ignore a revenue stream, remains heavily taxed. Unlike other destinations where digital apps silently handle the paperwork, South Walton demands the 5% tourist development tax be remitted directly by the host. This bureaucratic speed bump ensures the owner feels the psychological sting of every transaction. Profit only appears if the gross rent can plausibly outrun the expense stack, a terrifyingly vertical list of management fees that can claim 20% of revenue, coupled with aggressive new safety mandates. Following the Surfside collapse, Florida now requires milestone structural inspections for coastal buildings, forcing owners to fully fund fiscal reserves for a rainy day that is statistically guaranteed to arrive. The peril of this high-stakes game is best illustrated by the legendary 2005 buyer, a tragic archetype of the Florida condo market. An investor purchasing a $2 million unit at the peak of the bubble was shackled to a 6% interest rate, demanding nearly $10,000 a month before a single tourist unpacked a suitcase. This hypothetical buyer was immediately pummeled by skyrocketing insurance costs following the 2004 hurricanes. They were then kicked while down by the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which coated the beaches in tar and the ledger in red ink as local visitation abruptly dropped 13%. It was not until the drive-to-beach surge of 2020, a full 15 years later, that the combination of pandemic wanderlust and desperate refinancing finally allowed such properties to break even. The market here operates essentially like a finely crafted sailboat. It is beautiful to behold, exorbitantly expensive to captain, and entirely dependent on the favorable winds of low interest rates to move forward. When the wind dies, or when the heavy ballast of mandatory structural repairs drags the hull down, the vessel simply drifts, consuming cash rather than generating it. I checked the heavy bolt on the rental's door. I listened to the wind rattling the expensive stormproof glass. I calculated the true cost of my stay. Understanding how this hyper-engineered coastal machine evolved from a sandy frontier meant I would need to go find the working harbor where the region's luckiest gambles originally took place. Destin Secrets, fishing village to tourism hub. Profit margins and TDT remittances were swirling in my head like debris in a storm surge as I turned the ignition. I needed to escape the abstract anxieties of the 30A rental ledger and touch something real, something built of wood and salt rather than zoning codes and interest rates. Pending traffic flow analysis suggests a transit time of 42 minutes to the Destin limits, provided the bridge congestion remains within nominal parameters, I said, channeling my inner municipal planner. "It's Tuesday," my companion replied, looking out the window at the pines. "It won't take 20. We rounded the corner. We immediately hit a wall of brake lights stretching to the horizon. It was a glowing red river of stagnation that promised we would be part of the asphalt geology for the next hour. Our destination was a modest address on Stallman Avenue. We were headed to the Destin History and Fishing Museum. This small building functioned as the navigational anchor for the world's luckiest fishing village. The condo towers I had just left maximized short-term property yields. In contrast, this former town library guarded the memory of an older coastline. Entering the building felt like stepping into the collective subconscious of a people who viewed the ocean not as a scenic backdrop for real estate, but as a dangerous factory floor. The interior was a dense catalogue of the littoral zone. My attention was immediately seized by the mile-long fish wall. This 100-foot expanse of taxidermy functioned as a silent, scaled jury judging my lack of angling prowess. It is a spectacular brag board. The display mixes trophy mounts with touchscreen technology, allowing visitors to match species to the depths of the Gulf floor. It is part scientific field guide and part ego museum. Is it possible, I thought to myself, that the fish are actually watching us? That this is not a display of our conquest over nature, but a warning from the deep that we are merely hairless apes with expensive sticks? Or maybe I just need lunch. I moved deeper into the sanctum to inspect the angling gear. This varied collection chronicles the frantic technological arms race between man and snapper. There, protected under glass like a rare piece of maritime antiquity, lay a split bamboo rod paired with a pen reel. The placard detailed a legend that binds the local fleet to the global canon of literary machismo. The equipment is attributed to Ernest Hemingway. Whether Papa actually fought a marlin with this specific piece of bamboo or merely looked at it sternly while drinking a daiquiri is beside the point. It operates as a totem. It explains how stories travel from port to port, knitting together a fraternity of saltwater struggle. Outside, the Primrose awaited. She is a 36-foot seine boat built in 1925. Claiming she is just a boat is like saying a Category 5 hurricane is merely a change in the weather. She is the last of her kind built in Destin. This wooden Leviathan bridged the gap between the muscle-tearing era of oars and the noisy liberation of the combustion engine. She was the first vessel in town to be fitted with a motor. That installation operates as an object lesson in how technology alters the very texture of labor. She worked hard until 1968, lasting longer than most modern appliances. Now she rests as a teaching tool. Her hull is preserved through repeated restorations that feel less like routine maintenance and more like a permanent resurrection. To understand this coast, a visitor cannot simply gaze at a wooden boat. One must also trace the strategic forces that guarded it. This museum is the opening stop on a wider historical circuit. Just down the road lies the Heritage Park and Cultural Center in Fort Walton Beach. That complex contains the Indian Temple Mound Museum and the Civil War Exhibits Building, while holding the memories of the Camp Walton Schoolhouse and the Garnier Post Office. The regional narrative is inextricably bound to a massive military footprint. The Air Force Armament Museum near Eglin Air Force Base explains how local airspace and payrolls were completely reshaped by the needs of national defense. Together, these locations frame a coastline where fishing nets, military bases, and a stabilized inlet combine to turn a small, isolated harbor into a regional economic engine. The world's luckiest fishing village did not just get lucky. It was engineered, defended, and dredged into existence. Standing there, flanked by the ghost of the Primrose and the shadow of the distant condo towers, the truth of the drive settled upon me. We build museums to remember the work we no longer wish to do. We enshrine the sweat of our ancestors so we can feel virtuous while renting beach chairs. As Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Eglin's Arsenal, from SR 71 to Moab Museum Marvels. The art of war is of vital importance to the state, Sun Tzu wrote. That sentiment rings particularly true when the state in question is Florida, where the art involves transforming a coastal forest into a massive firing range. I left behind the quiet nostalgia of Stallman Avenue and the Primrose, that motorized wooden matriarch of the Destin fishing fleet. It was time to trade nets for napalm, To understand this coast, a visitor must acknowledge a basic division of labor. Local fishermen provided the dinner, but the federal government provided the security detail. I steered my luggage-laden rental car toward the western gate of Eglin Air Force Base to complete the historical circuit. The Air Force Armament Museum occupies a plot of land near Fort Walton Beach at 100 Museum Drive. It acts as the heavy artillery counterweight to the peaceful angling exhibits I had just departed. The facility eschews the subtle craft of baiting a hook for the significantly louder science of vaporizing a target. The institution bills itself as the only museum in the world devoted exclusively to Air Force armament and the aircraft that deliver it. That distinction feels hyper-specific and vaguely threatening. Outside the building, a petting zoo of aviation history dominates the grounds. This static lineup emphasizes the sheer physical scale of aerial dominance. The star of this asphalt stage is the SR-71A Blackbird. Arriving in the early 1990s, the aircraft remains a sleek, terrifying shard of midnight blue titanium. It anchors any conversation about reconnaissance, speed, and the audacity of flying at the edge of space. The jet rests silent now, a dormant predator surrounded by gunships that once rained lead upon specific coordinates of the Earth. These machines serve as a preamble to the collection inside. Standing before the grim visage of an AC-130 gunship, I assumed the steely, narrowed gaze of a veteran tactician born of 1,000 simulated conflicts, analyzing the lethal geometry of suppressing fire and the intricate ballet of close air support. In reality, I was merely squinting against the relentless panhandle glare, frantically trying to unstick my shirt from my lower back and wondering if the interior climate control was operational. Inside, the air conditioning offered a merciful tactical victory. The interior operates as a workshop turned into a classroom. Exhibits explain how sensors, guidance systems, and airframes evolved in tandem. It functions as a lesson in matching means to missions. The current facility emerged from structural failure. A previous iteration of the museum was condemned in 1981, suffering an ironic fate for a building dedicated to destruction by simply falling apart on its own. The revival operated as a purely private effort. Local residents raised the funds to construct this new building, which opened its doors in 1985. That civic maneuver ensured the collection of lethal hardware remained accessible to the tax-paying public. Visitors walk past rows of munitions tracing a century of explosive design, from the crude iron bombs of the early 20th century to the precision guidance of modern missiles. It tracks a continuous escalation of force. A prominent display features the GBU-43/B, better known as the Moab, or Massive Ordnance Air Blast. Standing next to it, the acronym's popular playground translation, Mother of All Bombs, feels less like hyperbole and more like an accurate biological classification. Historical panels and a looping film contextualize these weapons within the local geography. They track the military thread weaving through the region's payrolls and airspace. Eglin operates less as a neighbor and more as a landlord of continental proportions. The land range covers roughly 724 square miles, carved from the former Choctawhatchee National Forest during World War II. The adjacent Gulf Test and Training Range controls about 120,000 square miles of overwater airspace. This immense federal footprint acts as a buffer, securing jobs and inadvertently preserving vast green belts of wilderness, provided the wildlife tolerates the occasional sonic boom. Wandering through the gallery, the connection between the wooden primrose and the steel mobe solidified. The region operates as a paradox where serene beaches coexist with the machinery of war. The local heritage rests on a foundation of indigenous settlement and commercial fishing, yet that same coastline is guarded by advanced targeting systems. I exited the museum and blinked into the Florida sun, having traced the local arc from pioneer seine boats to supersonic reconnaissance. The Emerald Coast functions as a fortress disguised as a resort, a landscape where the sand is white, the water is emerald, and the sky is heavily guarded. As the philosopher George Orwell famously noted, "People sleep peaceably in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf." Walton County's Paradox, FL1's Lincoln Heritage. Steering my rental car east, away from the static fuselages of the Air Force Armament Museum, leads directly into the living political apparatus that funds them. Yet the local electorate, battling the simplistic labels of modern demographic maps, remains fiercely complex. It defies the tidy expectations of a standard history textbook. As I navigated deeper into the heart of Walton County, I crossed into Florida's first congressional district. This region is so reliably Republican that a Democratic yard sign is treated with genuine bewilderment. The statistics are about as subtle as one of Eglin's sonic booms. The area boasts a Cook partisan voting index of R+18, making it the most conservative district in the state. It is a landscape of retirees, property developers, and military personnel who generally prefer their government small, their taxes low, and their defense budgets atmospheric. This is the district that sent Joe Scarborough to Washington back when he was a standard-issue Chamber of Commerce conservative long before his morning television tenure, and later elected the populist firebrand Matt Gaetz. The rhetorical style changes, but the core substance, protecting the bases and the beach houses, remains as fixed as the coastline itself. However, the historical record reveals that this intense desire to go against the grain is actually a heritage skill. Before this stretch of the Panhandle became a deep red stronghold, it was a defiant pro-Union outlier in the heart of the Confederacy. In the 1860s, Walton County was largely populated by yeoman farmers and Scots Presbyterian descendants. They held old Whig loyalties and viewed the plantation class with deep suspicion. Because they worked small timber and fishing plots rather than vast agricultural estates, they had very little invested in the institution of slavery. Consequently, they viewed Abraham Lincoln's administration with far less dread than their neighbors did. When Florida called a convention in 1861 to discuss severing ties with the United States, Walton County voters did the unthinkable. They mobilized an almost unanimous anti-secession vote, electing delegates John Morrison and A.L. McCaskill with strict instructions to stop the madness. One can almost hear McCaskill's internal monologue as he rode toward the Capitol, shaking his head at the fervor of his peers. "I swear, if these hotheads drag us into a war over cotton prices when I just want to sell timber and fish in peace, I am going to be exceptionally vexed." The delegates followed their orders to the letter. While they conceded that a sovereign state theoretically possessed the right to withdraw, they argued that doing so was a massive tactical blunder. They voted against secession to the very last roll call. The hostility from the rest of the convention was so sharp that the pro-Confederate majority began mocking Walton by calling it Lincoln County. It was intended as a slur, branding the region as traitorous to the Southern cause. The locals, however, just ignored the insult and wore the name with stubborn indifference. Today, the political polarity has flipped, but the underlying personality of the region feels identical. Whether defying the Confederate government in 1861 or railing against the federal government in 2024, the residents of this coast maintain a multi-century commitment to being left alone. It creates a unique atmosphere where history does not repeat itself so much as it simply refuses to be told what to do. 30A's Ghosts, Unmasking Florida's Volatile Coast. That same defiant streak extends from the electorate straight into the geology. Returning to the unscripted chaos of the real world after a week immersed in the curated perfection of the 30A corridor prompts an uncomfortable question. Is this architectural serenity a natural state, or a very expensive lid placed atop a boiling pot? We spend days navigating the strict geometric logic of Seaside and the fortified white masonry of Alice Beach, momentarily convinced that we have tamed the Gulf Coast through the sheer force of zoning codes and pastel paint. Then the illusion fractures. The vacation technically concludes with the ritualistic packing of the SUV. It is a solemn game of Tetris played with luggage and inflatables. This is inevitably followed by the futile sweeping of the foyer. The cleaning routine is a tactical retreat from the persistent quartz dust that defies all containment strategies, providing a granular reminder that while we may rent the villa, the geology actually owns it. The landscape framed in the rear window ceases to be a static, sun-drenched postcard. The coastal inlets teem with ghosts whose stories overlap the modern asphalt. In 1528, Pánfilo de Narváez's lost expedition disintegrated right here. His splintered factions starved and vanished into a geography that offered no quarter. Decades later, Tristán de Luna's colonists stood on these same shifting footings, scanning the horizon with burning desperation for a relief fleet that a hurricane had already consigned to the seafloor. Later still, the Yuchi leader Timpoochee Trail and his people moved silently through this frontier. They executed a tactical navigation of a world that refused to be managed by European maps or American treaties. This final drive along Scenic Highway 30A strips away the marketed serenity to reveal the region's inherent volatility. The polished perfection of Seaside and the fortress-like construction of Alice Beach transcend aesthetic choices meant for magazine spreads. They are modern bulwarks raised against a history of violent erasure. The Truman Show calm pervading these streets operates as a negotiated peace. It is a fragile armistice maintained between the engineered intent of the new urbanists and the chaotic will of the Gulf. The coastal dune lakes function like a suppressed emotional memory. They well up silently behind a fragile berm of sand until the pressure becomes undeniable. When the rains swell and those sand berms finally fail, dark freshwater tannins mix violently with the salt. The illusion of control dissolves in a chaotic geological breakdown that completely kills the vibe. Ultimately, this coastline illustrates human persistence in a place that naturally resists permanence. From the shell middens of the archaic period to the artificial reefs deliberately sunk off Grayton Beach, the narrative relies entirely on adaptation. People return for more than the turquoise water. They come for the paradox. It is a landscape constantly washed away, yet stubbornly anchored in the sand through grit, massive insurance policies, and memory. The currents that carried the conquistadors to ruin and the oil spills to shore are the exact same currents that bring the dolphins and the tourists. It all comes out in the wash. From conquistadors wrecked by hurricanes to condos stress-tested by oil spills and a global pandemic, this stretch of the Florida Panhandle has been running the same experiment for 5 centuries. How much punishment can a coast absorb before it redesigns itself? Personally, I find the Deepwater Horizon recovery arc the most clarifying thread in the whole journey because it shows that a place's resilience isn't romantic, it's arithmetic, driven by financing rates, marketing budgets, and whether your outfall structure can handle a Category 4. This is the final chapter of the road, so rather than a tease, consider this an open invitation to go back to the beginning and follow the full route from first settlement to 30A design codes, because the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquistadors and Condos. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community on Patreon. Until the next road, this has been The Rise the Limit.